Hello, this is Dr. James Bogash, expert in health and longevity and creator of Bogash Life and Balance. Today's presentation, or today's review, has a lot of moving parts and some numbers, so I thought I'd present it as PowerPoint just so you can get a better visual of what we're talking about here, because it's a really important topic. And it has everything to do with the evidence on people who have had COVID and their likelihood of getting it again, as well as should we get vaccinated after, or what happens if we've had COVID and then we get vaccinated. So both of these studies come out of Qatar. I'm not quite sure why. Qatar seems to be a hot spot. They do have a really good grasp on all the data, which makes a big difference in being able to publish. So that may be a part of it. It is a relatively young population, and so deaths from COVID are not very high, and that certainly changes things considering the rest of the world that has, especially when we have older populations that are susceptible to this. But so if we look in here, this is what happens. So what they did is they looked at, and what's also unique about COVID is in the first wave, so up till like June of 2020, they had quite a few cases in there where they estimated, based on antibody levels in the bloodstream, for whatever that's worth, that upwards of 40% of the population had been exposed to COVID. So that's a pretty large chunk to work with. And so then they looked at a very large database, and here 1,531,736 people who are vaccinated in Qatar with the mRNA. So that's either the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine. Almost twice as many were in Pfizer for whatever reason. That seems to be pretty consistent across lots of the states. Maybe it's just purely boils down to marketing. But when we look at in the Pfizer group that were vaccinated, so 99,226%, or 226,000 of them had prior COVID infection. That's a pretty large number, and that's based on PCR testing. 159 of them were reinfected over this time frame. And so you're looking at now keep in mind, these are people that were vaccinated who had COVID before they were vaccinated. 0.16% of them were reinfected, 17 died. So that's a practically zero number of them. In the people that did not have a prior infection, 2,500 of them got infected, so 0.86%, still a really low number, and 62 of them died, which is 0.02%. So clearly, having had COVID remained very protective in the vaccinated population. When we look at the Moderna's numbers, they were actually a little bit stronger for people who had prior infection. So in this case, there were 58,000 people who had prior infection. 43% of them, or 43 of them, were reinfected, which is 0.07%. So we're not even talking about 0.1%. We're talking about 0.07. 5 of them died. 514 did not have a prior infection. Of that group, 368 were infected and 25 died. So what does this boil down to in numbers? First of all of those cases were very low, especially in the group that had prior infection. So Pfizer, for the people who had no prior infection, the cases were 5.4 times higher than the people who actually had COVID prior. Moderna, the cases was not quite as protective for cases, 3.4 times higher for the Moderna, but Moderna overall was stronger with prior infection. So the percentage of people who had prior infection got the Moderna vaccine was lower than those same group of people that got Pfizer instead. What was interesting was that people who had COVID more than 6 months ago, more than 6 months prior to their vaccine, were actually more protected than the people who had it within 6 months. So that's that whole conversation about how long does the immunity last, we don't really know, and how it's not going to be long enough. This is suggesting that on top of everything else, the longer you had been through since the vaccine, the better off. Now that kind of makes sense, because what we want to do is remind the immune system, but not remind it too quickly. And so getting reminded 6 months later, in this particular case, showed a stronger benefit than people who had it less than 6 months. So, what was interesting also is by 4 months, the groups in the vaccine only, so the people who didn't have COVID before they got vaccinated, that protection started to tank, which we're really starting to see, and we really need to admit that by 4 months, things are really starting to tank. By 8 months, they are almost non-existent, especially in the populations that we would most likely to protect. This effect in Pfizer was much greater than it was in Moderna. You can see that on the graphs pretty clearly. Previously infected that got vaccinated drops. The effectiveness does drop, but it drops much slower at a much different rate than the people who did not have infection. So this is for people who decide, and most of the data suggests that a single vaccination afterwards, after getting infected, not getting infected after, because we're not quite sure where that puts you, but having a single vaccination after getting infected will probably give you a little bit of a bump of an edge. In this study, it shows that people who had COVID and got vaccinated did way better than the people who just got vaccinated. Now, we'll go in the next couple slides, we're going to go into the fact that we shouldn't have COVID parties. But clearly this is a different population that we are ignoring, is what happens with people who had COVID. So then what happens if we look at these same people in Qatar, different group, different study, who had been, we're not talking vaccination, we're just talking about people who had COVID in their first wave. So typically like March through June of 20, they identified 266,000 people who had tested positive on PCR, and then they looked at what happened to them in the next wave when it hit between January and May of 21. 1,339 were reinfected. That's 0.5%. Half of 1% people were reinfected who had got it initially. Now those protections are stronger than what you see with the vaccination. 4 severe with no ICU. So essentially that boils down to 0. It's not 0, especially those 4 people. There were no deaths in the people who got reinfected in that group. What was interesting is the average was 277 days later. So we see that in the people that got reinfected, it was pretty far out. And that's always been the thing. Well, how long does it last? Well, clearly it's lasting far longer than the vaccination does, because this is by 277 days, the vaccination is starting to tank. This was mostly beta, some alpha. This was pre-delta data, and so that may change things. But so what's the take-home message with these 2 studies is that ignoring the people that have recovered from COVID flies in the face of repeated studies on outcomes. We're not looking at lab values, we're looking at outcomes of people who got infected and what happened with them as far as severity. And when we ignore that or we downplay that, we're driving a wedge in society, and we're seeing that. It's like we have all this data that people have readily accessible, and yet we have public health people completely ignoring the idea that recovered people continually show in the studies that they are well protected. Now, anybody can become reinfected. You beat up your immune system enough, and you're going to get reinfected with something. I would imagine that being infected and having a good, healthy immune system, making the right choices, pretty much puts you in the large chunk of people that did not get reinfected in a time frame of this. And so basically, immunity from prior infection outperforms and outlasts vaccination. We've said the opposite, and yet the data continues to show that this is the case, and this Qatar study is just yet another one. Now, we're not suggesting, nobody's suggesting we should have COVID parties and everybody should get together and get infected with COVID, but clearly the large chunk of people that have been infected cannot be ignored, and that's exactly what we're doing when we're talking about vaccine mandates without any consideration for whether or not somebody has been infected. As always, I will post a link to these two particular studies in the description. Make sure you like this video, share it with somebody who you think needs the information, and subscribe to the channel.